You won't believe what happened when I moved into what I thought was my dream neighborhood. Picture this: a quiet suburban street with perfectly manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a homeowners association that promised to maintain property values. What I got instead was 3 years of harassment, illegal fines, and power trips from the most corrupt HOA president you've ever heard of. But here's the thing about bullies: they always underestimate their victims. And Patricia Morrison, our self-appointed neighborhood dictator, had no idea she was about to mess with someone who could destroy her completely. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a retired municipal attorney who spent 30 years specializing in housing law and consumer protection. When I bought my house on Maple Grove Drive, I was looking forward to peaceful retirement. The house was perfect, a charming 2-story colonial with a beautiful garden. The neighborhood seemed ideal: mature trees, well-maintained sidewalks, and neighbors who actually waved when you drove by. For the first few months, everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. I settled into my routines, joined the neighborhood book club, and began planning improvements to my garden. The HOA seemed normal, sending out quarterly newsletters and reminders about seasonal maintenance. I even attended a few board meetings to stay informed about neighborhood issues. That's when I first encountered Patricia Morrison. She was in her mid-50s, always impeccably dressed in designer suits, and carried herself with artificial authority that immediately put people on edge. During board meetings, she dominated every conversation, cut off other board members, and had an answer for everything, even when she was clearly wrong. Other residents seemed intimidated by her, avoiding eye contact and rarely challenging her decisions. I noticed small things at first: violation notices for minor infractions that seemed overly harsh. A neighbor getting fined $3,000 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another family receiving a $5,000 citation because their children's bicycles were visible in their driveway overnight. These weren't reasonable community standards. They were power trips designed to generate revenue and assert control. The neighborhood itself was undeniably beautiful. Maple Grove Drive featured 43 homes built in the 1980s, each sitting on half-acre lots with mature landscaping. But Patricia Morrison had turned it into her personal kingdom. She'd been HOA president for 6 years, running unopposed because she'd systematically intimidated anyone who might challenge her authority. I started paying closer attention to HOA communications and board meeting minutes. Patricia had implemented enhanced community standards, which essentially meant she could issue fines for virtually anything she deemed inappropriate. Garbage cans visible for more than 4 hours after pickup, lawn height exceeding 2.5 inches, any outdoor decorations not explicitly approved in advance, and dozens of other nitpicky rules designed to generate revenue. The more I researched, the more concerned I became. Patricia's salary had increased by 40% over the past 3 years. The HOA reserve fund seemed surprisingly small for a community our size, and the violation fines were being collected by a management company that Patricia had hired without board approval. I started attending board meetings regularly, taking notes, and asking questions about budget items and policy decisions. Patricia clearly didn't appreciate the scrutiny. She began making comments about new residents who didn't understand how things worked. She started enforcing rules more strictly for newer residents, and I noticed selective enforcement against families who questioned her authority. But I was patient. 30 years of legal experience had taught me the importance of building a solid case before taking action. I documented everything, photographed examples of selective enforcement, and began researching state laws governing homeowners associations. What I found was disturbing. Patricia Morrison wasn't just power-hungry. She was systematically violating state housing laws and potentially committing fraud. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in October. I had taken my garbage cans to the curb the night before, just like every week for the past 2 years. Pickup was scheduled for 7 a.m., and I usually brought the cans back around 8:30. That morning, I received an important phone call from my former law firm, and the conversation went longer than expected. When I finally made it outside to retrieve my garbage cans, it was about 7:40 a.m., maybe 20 minutes later than usual. As I was pulling the cans back toward my garage, I saw Patricia Morrison marching across the street with her clipboard, measuring tape, and camera. She was wearing one of her signature power suits and had the determined expression that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. She started talking before she even reached my driveway. Something about community standards and property values, and how newer residents needed to understand that their actions affected everyone. She was taking photos of my garbage cans, measuring distances, and making notes like she was conducting some kind of official investigation. I tried to explain that I'd been on an important phone call and was only 20 minutes later than usual, but Patricia wasn't interested in explanations. She informed me that garbage cans were required to be removed within 30 minutes of pickup, and that visible garbage cans violated community aesthetic standards. She handed me a bright yellow violation notice with a fine amount that made my jaw drop. $15,000 for having my garbage cans visible for 20 minutes longer than Patricia Morrison deemed appropriate. The violation notice cited multiple community standards violations, aesthetic impact penalties, and repeat offender surcharges, even though this was literally my first violation ever. It demanded payment within 30 days and threatened foreclosure proceedings. I looked at this woman, standing in my driveway with her fake smile and her clipboard full of made-up violations, and I realized something important. Patricia Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life, because she hadn't picked on some random homeowner who would quietly pay an outrageous fine. She had decided to mess with a retired municipal attorney who specialized in housing law and had spent 3 decades fighting exactly this kind of corruption. That afternoon, I spread the violation notice across my dining room table and began legal analysis. The fine amount immediately caught my attention because state housing law clearly specified that HOA fines couldn't exceed $500 for any single violation, with a maximum annual total of $2,000 per property. Patricia's $15,000 fine violated state law by approximately $14,500. The violation notice itself was legally problematic in multiple ways. It didn't include required language about appeals processes, failed to cite specific community standards that had been properly adopted, and included penalty categories that weren't mentioned anywhere in our HOA governing documents. Patricia hadn't just issued an excessive fine, she'd created an entirely fictional enforcement framework with no legal basis. I pulled out files from previous board meetings and started cross-referencing Patricia's claims with actual HOA documents. The aesthetic impact penalties didn't exist in our community standards. The repeat offender surcharges weren't mentioned in any policy document, and the 30-minute garbage can rule had never been voted on by the board. Patricia had literally made up rules and penalties as she went along. Over the next several weeks, I began gathering evidence and building a comprehensive case. I reviewed every board meeting minute from the past 3 years, looking for patterns of illegal decision-making and financial irregularities. What I found was worse than expected. Patricia had been approving her own salary increases without board votes, hiring contractors without competitive bidding, and collecting fines through unauthorized third-party companies that charged additional processing fees. I started reaching out quietly to other homeowners who had received violation notices, offering to review their citations for legal compliance. What I discovered was systematic fraud spanning 3 years and affecting nearly every family in our neighborhood. Patricia had issued over 200 violation notices, with fines ranging from $2,000 to $20,000, collecting approximately $600,000 in illegal penalties. The evidence-gathering phase took about 6 weeks. I documented every illegal fine, every violation of state housing law, every example of Patricia abusing her authority for personal financial gain. I obtained bank records, reviewed contractor agreements that violated competitive bidding requirements, and identified dozens of instances where Patricia had acted without proper board authorization. I reached out to former colleagues at the State Attorney General's office, specifically the Consumer Protection Division that handled HOA fraud cases. What I was offering them was a fully documented, prosecutable case of systematic fraud with clear evidence and quantifiable damages. The legal strategy I developed had 4 phases. Phase 1 was completing evidence gathering and building relationships with affected homeowners. Phase 2 was filing formal complaints with state regulatory agencies while preparing a class action lawsuit. Phase 3 was criminal referrals and media exposure. Phase 4 was the coordinated legal assault that would eliminate Patricia's ability to fight back. By December, I was ready to move to Phase 2. I had 47 families who wanted to join a class action lawsuit, each with documented evidence of illegal fines and systematic abuse. I contacted Maria Rodriguez, a friend from law school who now ran a consumer protection practice specializing in HOA abuse cases. She agreed to represent our class action lawsuit on a contingency basis, meaning Patricia would ultimately pay all our legal fees when we won. The criminal complaint was filed with the State Attorney General's office in early January. The civil lawsuit followed 2 weeks later. I wanted to coordinate the timing carefully to maximize the psychological impact on Patricia Morrison. The first strike happened on a Wednesday morning in late January. Patricia was conducting one of her typical board meetings, dominating the conversation and cutting off anyone who tried to ask questions. About 20 minutes into the meeting, my attorney Maria Rodriguez walked into the community center with a state investigator and a process server. The look on Patricia's face was absolutely priceless. Complete shock, then confusion, then the dawning realization that something very serious was happening. The state investigator introduced himself and announced that they were there to execute a search warrant for all HOA financial records, bank statements, contractor agreements, and board meeting minutes from the past 3 years. While Patricia was trying to process what was happening, the process server handed her papers for our class action lawsuit. 47 families demanding full refunds of illegal fines, plus punitive damages, legal fees, and compensation for emotional distress. The lawsuit named Patricia personally, along with the HOA board and the third-party management company. Then Maria served her with the criminal complaint for embezzlement, fraud, and violation of state housing laws. The complaint detailed every illegal fine, every unauthorized expenditure, every violation of proper governance procedures. All of this happened in front of the entire board and about 15 neighborhood residents. Patricia tried to speak, but nothing came out. Her hands were shaking as she read through the legal papers. The state investigation moved quickly because the evidence was so comprehensive. Within 2 weeks, investigators had uncovered additional violations I hadn't discovered, including kickback arrangements with contractors and unauthorized use of HOA funds to pay for Patricia's personal legal expenses. Patricia hired an expensive attorney and tried to fight back by filing counter lawsuits against me and several other homeowners. She claimed we were harassing her and damaging her reputation. This was exactly the mistake I'd been hoping she would make, because her counter lawsuits just gave us more opportunities to gather evidence. During the discovery process, we uncovered even more evidence of systematic fraud. Falsified inspection reports, forged board meeting minutes, and email communications with contractors that clearly showed kickback arrangements. The state attorney general's office expanded their investigation and started looking into other HOAs managed by the same company Patricia had hired. Local news stations picked up the story and began running daily updates about HOA corruption. Property management companies throughout the state started reviewing their practices to avoid being associated with the scandal. Other neighborhoods began investigating their own HOA boards, and several additional criminal complaints were filed. Patricia had accidentally triggered a statewide crackdown on HOA corruption. The media attention was particularly satisfying because Patricia had always been obsessed with her reputation and social status. Now her name was associated with fraud and embezzlement. Her real estate license was suspended pending the criminal investigation, and several professional organizations began disciplinary proceedings. Patricia's desperation was obvious as she realized her usual intimidation tactics weren't working. She tried offering to reduce fines for families who would drop out of the lawsuit. She attempted to replace board members who were cooperating with investigators. She even tried to dissolve the HOA entirely to avoid paying restitution. None of it worked because I'd anticipated every possible defense strategy. The final blow came 6 months later in the county courthouse. Patricia had to face a judge for the criminal charges while simultaneously dealing with our civil lawsuit. The prosecutor presented evidence of $85,000 in embezzled HOA funds, hundreds of illegal fines totaling over $600,000, and systematic fraud spanning 3 years. The judge was clearly not impressed with Patricia's attempts to justify her actions. Patricia Morrison was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, ordered to pay full restitution to all affected homeowners, fined an additional $50,000, and permanently banned from serving in any HOA governance role anywhere in the state. The civil judgment was even more satisfying. Patricia had to sell her house to pay damages totaling $830,000, plus legal fees for all 47 families. The third-party management company was also found liable and had to pay additional damages. But here's the best part. The judge ordered that the entire HOA board be dissolved and replaced with newly elected representatives. Every single illegal fine issued during Patricia's reign of terror was refunded with interest. The HOA governing documents were rewritten to include proper checks and balances. Our neighborhood became a model for HOA reform throughout the state. Property values actually increased because people wanted to live in a community where corruption couldn't take root. New state legislation was passed specifically because of our case, making HOA financial fraud a felony with mandatory minimum sentences. The aftermath was better than I could have possibly imagined. Patricia Morrison lost her house, her freedom, her professional licenses, and her reputation, all because she decided to issue a $15,000 fine for garbage cans being visible 20 minutes longer than she preferred. She's currently serving her sentence and will be making restitution payments for the rest of her life. Our new HOA board operates with complete transparency. All meetings are recorded and available to residents. Financial reports are detailed and independently audited. We actually function like a legitimate homeowners association instead of Patricia Morrison's personal money-making scheme. I've been invited to speak at legal conferences about HOA reform. The case has been featured in law school textbooks as an example of how systematic documentation and coordinated legal strategy can defeat institutional corruption. Several states have used our case as a model for strengthening their own HOA oversight laws. Every morning when I take my garbage cans to the curb, I remember Patricia Morrison trying to fine me $15,000 for being 20 minutes late, bringing them back. Now she's in prison. I'm helping other communities fight HOA corruption, and our neighborhood is a model for how homeowners associations should operate. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just defeating your enemy, it's building a better system that prevents future victims. Sometimes justice really does work exactly the way it's supposed to. And sometimes bullies get exactly what they deserve, especially when they pick on the wrong person. Patricia Morrison thought she could intimidate and exploit families who just wanted to live peacefully in their homes. Instead, she created a legal precedent that protects homeowners throughout our state and inspired reforms that will prevent thousands of future victims. Her $15,000 garbage can fine cost her everything, and I couldn't be more satisfied with that outcome. This is what happens when petty tyrants underestimate their victims. This is what justice looks like when people fight back with knowledge, preparation, and determination. And this is why bullies should always remember that their next victim might be someone who can destroy them completely.